Up until about 5 seconds ago, civilizationally speaking, almost all countries had one type of propaganda for the internal consumption and a different type of propaganda, sometimes with the opposite message, for external consumption. Now, the increasing speed with which information, including propaganda, can be spread via the internet left most countries without that option. So now most countries are relatively consistent in their messaging, and when they're not, it's usually in more marginal cases. China is one of the few places that can still afford to do that, not for much longer, but they can still afford to do it for now, due to the fact that they keep their internet insulated from the rest of the world. It's called the Great Firewall of China, and as a result, they can at least pretend that nobody knows what they're doing. Now, of course, that's not how it works in practice, but still, it's good enough that we get to watch some double standards in the internal and external propaganda. And also we get some sample of honesty that would definitely not appear in a newspaper in Mandarin. So yeah, these would be the two topics. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome once again to the Propaganda Basement. So, China Daily, July the 28th through August the 3rd, 2023. More realism, socialism type of cover. Change is brewing, but this time they mean it literally. Rise in China's cafe culture has seen many new jobs created for young disabled people. The edition of this newspaper is mostly affirmative action and inclusiveness. And on one hand, they mean it literally, in the sense that they created a small ecosystem which may or may not provide jobs for disabled people and whatnot, which is, kind of sounds cringe, but it's not really a bad thing, or whatever. It's probably inefficient, but that's a separate story. But also they mean it affirmative action and inclusiveness in geopolitics, and this one is, of course, of bigger interest. So, geopolitics of the West undermine the world order. Quote, international organizations are facing a crisis of legitimacy and effectiveness, in turn a symptom of the crisis of multilateralism. The critical years of COVID-19 revealed the difficulties that the WHO had in meeting its institutional objectives. Some Western leaders politicized the COVID-19 pandemic, and they did not take any steps to reduce the contagion risks that people in poorer countries suffered. Recently, during the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact, hosted by French President in Paris, Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa, said that African countries felt like we were beggars when it came to vaccine availability. Now, of course, no mention of the fact that Africa didn't need any of those. The Northern Hemisphere countries had bought all of the vaccines in the world, and they didn't want to release them at the time when we needed them the most. According to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals report, the pandemic has set back progress towards Sustainable Development Goals by decades across all areas. So what the CCP is telling me is that the pandemic project was also a good thing. The International Monetary Fund has estimated the cumulative financial loss through 2024 due to the pandemic at $13.8 trillion. Yeah, that's all guesswork. I mean, I wouldn't take any of this seriously. But this is due to the pandemic or the lack of solidarity and the greed of the wealthiest countries. Talking about the IMF, its legitimacy is also in question, as it fails to convince many countries that it can help their economies. Argentina is the principal debtor to the IMF, and its relationship with the international organization goes back to the 1980s without any substantial improvement to its economy. So, maybe there is an issue. US-led selective multilateralism and attempts to isolate China create multiple global crises. So you can see that right on the front page, the introductory of the article is in more relatively neutral term, And then once you go, it says here, continue to page 20. So we go straight up to page 20. Of course, there is also some more anti-NATO thing. We're not going to go through that. Then it goes straight to the jugular. So, although the IMF is dominated by the US, which holds 17% of the voting rights in a system that requires 85% consent, the US is upset by the growing presence of Chinese banks in the world and claims to want to prevent countries borrowing from the IMF to use those funds for repayment of Chinese loans. Interestingly, Argentina made a significant payment to the IMF using yuan from the Central Bank of China. The rise of the Chinese economy and the fact that China is a very active country in several international organizations seems to have motivated the US to disengage from the multilateral system that it created in the 20th century. Furthermore, former President Donald Trump started a trade war against China by imposing additional tariffs on Chinese products, and he's back, baby. The competition with China has made the US more protectionist and caused some damage to multilateralism. Oh, okay, so you're telling me that Trump was good. But with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and with NATO backing Ukraine, multilateralism is at serious risk. Now you will notice that multilateralism is not at serious risk with China backing Russia, but it's only a problem if NATO backs Ukraine. Right? It's always this issue. This conflict could acquire more significant proportions, and the countries in the conflict are looking for international support. Fortunately, the detachment of the vast majority of developing countries has been noteworthy, as it can be interpreted as a generalized dissatisfaction of these countries with the way in which NATO, Ukraine, and Russia are dealing with this complex situation. The crisis of multilateralism is a crisis of Western leadership. Instead of committing to inclusive multilateralism, the most powerful countries in the West are practicing selective multilateralism, trying to isolate China and threatening other developing countries not aligned with their will. The West's selective multilateralism is contrary to the spirit of the UN Charter. Who cares? The foundations of the post-war order are being shaken. The world is at dangerous crossroads. Fortunately, developing countries are rightly keeping a relative distance from the Ukraine crisis. But although this distance can stand between them and irresponsible acts, silence is not an option. So what you're saying is that it's bad when the West tries to threat countries, developing countries not aligned with their will. Okay, that's bad. But then you come and say, oh, but silence is not an option, dear silent developing nation. So maybe you should align with China's will. Because at least in the past, when it was in the past, before 1991, the term third world was not about economics, it was about geopolitics. The third world was the non-aligned movement, which included both communist and capitalist countries that did not align with the Soviet bloc or the Western bloc. These days, as this newspaper remarks, there is also a non-aligned world that doesn't necessarily comprise a movement, but this time you have one of the blocs, the Sino-Russian bloc, that claims that it trying to gain influence there is irrelevant, but the West trying to get influence there is very bad. At least the Soviets were a bit more honest about these things. Perhaps it is time to convene a new Bandung conference in order to include all peaceful countries. This is also as crucial as the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, so it's not important. The UN's Agenda for Sustainable Development is really not important, so, The conference for inclusive multilateralism would be in line with the China proposed Global Civilization Initiative. Oh my goodness, what a coincidence. Which advocates a real dialogue and inclusiveness among civilizations. Yes, I'm sure the Ugandan civilization, where you're grifting off their natural resources, is really, really included as a peer in your global initiative project. Come on, give me a break. The language of cooperation and peace must speak louder to save multilateralism, and this language increasingly depends on developing countries. So what you're saying is that globalism, because that's what really multilateralism is, globalism is effectively third worldism. Well, thank you for agreeing with me. I mean, I've been trying to explain that for quite some time. Of course, the Chinese propaganda tries to say that no, third worldism is good. Well, of course, because they are third worldist as well. Whereas I say, no, third worldism is still bad, just like it was always bad. And if you say multilateralism is third worldism, then fine, I agree, let's ditch it. Maybe we should stop engaging in third worldism. I don't know, maybe. No, not really, but seriously, it's quite astounding to witness this kind of blatant hypocrisy, which is also surprising because I expect to see this kind of crap from Russia. I mean, Russia is historically known not to give a damn too much about this, but I didn't expect it to see it from China. I mean, at least China used to be a little bit more refined with these kinds of things. Even with most of the newspapers we've read so far this season, the type of propaganda, the type of narrative promoted was a little bit more refined. I mean, at least it didn't assume that you were stupid when reading it. But this one is taking me for a fool. Anyway, develop deep love for the motherland. In a letter to Hong Kong students, Xi underlines patriotism as the core of Chinese national spirit. Nice threat. President Xi Jinping has called on students from Hong Kong's special administrative region to develop a deep love for the motherland and its people, hone their abilities, and become talents capable of shouldering important responsibilities from an early age. In his reply from a letter from students at Pui Kiu Middle School, Xi underlined patriotism as the core of the Chinese national spirit, saying the noble tradition of loving both the motherland and Hong Kong, long upheld by the Hong Kong people, is a crucial cornerstone for the stable and enduring implementation of one country, two systems. Yes, no, this is a threat, actually, and it is a threat, again, context. Prior to the pandemic project, the CCP had a huge problem on its hands, which that problem was a very genuine, not necessarily pro-democracy, but definitely anti-CCP protest movement, dare I say revolutionary protest movement, and then, which eventually turned into a very open pro-Western movement. I mean, I remember in 2019 and 2020 even discussing this with some of my friends, that in the West you had Westerners burning the US flag, burning the British flag, burning the French flag or the German flag, and being proud of it in the name of anti-colonialism or whatnot. Meanwhile, in the former colony of Hong Kong, they were proudly using the flag of the United States in particular, but also of the United Kingdom, as a point of pride and also as a protest symbol against the CCP, effectively saying, we actually liked it when we were a Western colony, and I don't blame them. Hong Kong was a much nicer place prior to being, given back, it was said at the time. I would say just ceded from our civilization back to the barbarians, but then again, I suppose that's racist to say these days. Farms are vital to food security, says the president. Good morning. Yeah, okay, that's very profound, Mr. President. Although, I would say it is very profound, especially for the European leaders. I mean, in Europe, we have plenty of politicians who seem to have forgotten just how important the farms are. Don't don't start a fight. Don't pick up a fight with the people who produce your food. It's usually a bad idea. All right. So this is the article that I was having in mind in the intro when I said that there are some countries that can afford to have double type of propaganda, like straight up double speak. One thing they say at home and another thing they say abroad. Renminbi globalization is good for the world. Currencies internationalization will help encourage economic stability, further opening up, experts say. Right, again, experts say, of course. The internationalization of the renminbi is gathering momentum, and the trend will facilitate China's further opening up and encourage the country's global trade. The remarks came after global financial messaging platform SWIFT announced on July the 20th that RMB's share in global payments had increased for 5 consecutive months to 2.77% in June, the highest level since January 2022 when the share was 3.2%. The renminbi share stood at 2.54 in May, whatever. As of the end of 2022, the renminbi internationalization index increased by 18% from the previous year, and it's maintaining long-term upward trend, a research report, whatever. Speaking at the forum held in Beijing, Chen Yulu, president of Nankai University, said the renminbi is gaining momentum in its level of internationalization, and it is expected to become the most dynamic and promising global high-quality public product. Yes, now I mentioned throughout this season that in fact the share of the renminbi or the yuan in the global economy is lower than it should be, and given the sheer size of the manufacturing sector in China, and also the size of its consumer market, which should be bigger, but it's not because it's a communist country, the share of the yuan in the global economy should be higher if left naturally to grow as a result of a totally market-dominated economy. But that's not the case because it's a communist country. So, if unironically, China would be a serious power if not for communism. But that's one aspect. But second aspect, probably even more important than that, is that this whole thing of look how great that the renminbi is used more and more internationally, you will not read this one in a Chinese language newspaper for the Chinese market. Why? Because inside China, more people are aware of this tiny little fact, which is that there is no such thing as one yuan, right? Most people globally do not trade and do not travel to those places, and as a result are not fully aware of this thing. China doesn't have one currency, it has three. The renminbi, the RMB, which that's the international symbol for it, this one is the external yuan that you can take with you. Then there is the internal yuan, international symbol CNY, and then there is the digital yuan, which should have been of the same value as a CNY, but tradable internationally, but it's not. It's tradable internationally, but it's not the same value as the CNY or the RMB for that matter. The digital yuan caught a life of its own. And I honestly expected over the last 2, 3, 4 years now to see the CCP coming up with an initiative of a monetary reform to somehow unify all of these three currencies, because unironically that would be good for China. But as it turns out, that's very difficult to achieve because there's plenty of local business interests that profit tremendously from this discrepancy and from the existence of this issue. So as a result, the CCP is postponing this moment. Of course, in public they don't offer any justification, but ultimately they don't have to because, well, it's a dictatorship, so there's that. But this is an example of internal and external propaganda. Internally, nobody would would publish too much about this, because internally, eventually, someone will ask, even if it is a little bit risky, will ask, okay, hold on a second, which renminbi and how does that square with the rest of the currencies that we have in our country? So there's that. All right. And then there is, again, more inclusivity and affirmative action. This one was really funny. The author is an executive director of the Pakistan Research Center for a Community with Shared Future in Islamabad. I'm pretty sure this is a highly respected institute in Pakistan. Khalid Taimur Akram, China's focus on citizens' well-being via inclusive, equitable growth shows path forward for the world, uplifting people by upholding basic rights. I mean, this is pure comedy, right? Pakistan, where you still have religious-based harassment and religious-based violence, and whose governance is okay, not a dictatorship, but definitely autocracy-ish. It's a hybrid democracy at best. Lauds the straight-up dictatorship who practices religious-based gulags. against Muslims, which are actually more close to Pakistan on this issue. It's really pure comedy. The 53rd session of the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution titled "The Contribution of Development to Enjoyment of All Human Rights." In the statement, the head of the Chinese mission at the UN in Geneva stressed that development and human rights are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. So essentially what China is trying to do in diplomatic setting, I like this in this intro, what China is trying to do in diplomatic setting here is to establish a global standard for what does human rights mean. Now, to be fair, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Of course, I would disagree with the definition because the definition of human rights by a communist state is probably not fully agreeable. But nevertheless, the attempt here is to have a universally accepted definition of human rights outside of the Universal Declaration, which obviously China doesn't observe, and to have it interlinked and mutually reinforced with development. So basically a normative materialist view of human rights. Human rights are being correctly observed if everyone has a bowl of rice, but if nobody can speak their mind, that's okay. That's basically the Chinese view. China has long upheld the basic human rights to existence and development. The Communist Party has always been dedicated to upholding, defending, and expanding human rights, as well as enhancing a sense of fulfillment, security, and happiness among its citizens. I don't know, those 200 million protesters earlier in 2023, this newspaper is from 2023, they probably disagree, as well as probably most of the people in Uyghuristan, but okay. China's development experiences and the road to modest prosperity have made the framework supporting human rights more resilient. The path to universal moderate prosperity in China is the expansion and modernization of global human rights, which encompasses all necessary actions to safeguard and advance the rights of everyone. There has been huge success in raising the living conditions. There you go. So very, very normative materialist. Some of the characteristics of the development for the path for the integration of all ethnic groups in China under the leadership of the Communist Party include fairness, unity and tranquility among all ethnic groups, the participation of all ethnic groups, the integration of economic and social development, and the equal protection of the linguistic and cultural rights of all ethnic groups. Yes, that is somewhat true, except again the Uyghurs. In order to advance all essential freedoms and human rights in every way, social, cultural, religious, and economic liberty and democratic rights, as well as other rights, are protected. Yeah, economic liberty and democratic rights in China. Who the hell are you talking about, mate? What the hell is wrong with you? Now, of course, we already know what is wrong with him. The Pakistan Research for a Community with Shared Future, writing for China Daily. So we already know what's wrong with it. But what I'm saying is that the CCP is succeeding in selling a version of human rights that is not upsetting that many people. It's basically the same discussion that I mentioned in the previous episode when you have too many idiosyncrasies, dare I say, in the Western model of development that piss off too many people and just loses support. China is basically saying, okay, look, we actually agree with you. We prefer a more modest, even it says modest prosperity, right? We prefer a more modest view, including a modest materialist view, so you don't have to be that wealthy. But in return, just shut up and don't talk about it. Which sounds terrifying and unacceptable for most in the West. And we do have our own Chinese shills, of course, but not as many. But it sounds very acceptable to a lot of Asian peoples. And I know this upsets Western leftists and even some Asian Americans, but it's still true. Most Asian peoples, with very few exceptions and very punctual exceptions, are just a little bit more accepting of authority in ways that, Europeans and North Americans are just not. So there's that. Point of conclusion. Instead of a conclusion, The West needs to get its shit together and correct some or most of its excesses, or else China will be having your lunch. Not today, not tomorrow. I'm not trying to sell counter panic porn, because this newspaper already sells a lot of panic porn for Westerners. So I'm not trying to sell counter panic porn. But I am saying that this kind of messaging, although ridiculous if you know all of the context, it actually works for people who don't know all of the context, which is most people. I'm just saying. But, okay, you can also assume that I'm entirely wrong. Keep doing things the way they're being done today, with too much extremist crap tethered into the human rights narrative, and see how that functions. I'm more than willing to predict the outcome, because we all know that will be the outcome. But hey, what do I know? So that was it for this episode. Thanks a lot for watching. If you like this kind of content, please do consider becoming a member of the Donor Circle. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.